That's everyone. Without further ado, call upon the Prime Minister here.
So in current status quo, we live in the world where everyone going to chase the high income and they're going to chase the better life and they're going to pursue anything to make their life better and become more happy. And how to do it? By pursuing the high income in their work, in their work life, and especially how they are improving their skill and stuff and stuff and stuff. But the reality is here. As the individual working class, this kind of people have no chances or small chances to advance their skills. That's the first. And second thing, they have no proper background to have the opportunity to increase their wages. Because of that, we are as the individual in the working class, we believe that it's better with the low income inequality and the low average income. Because with this, everyone going to be happy, no matter in what class you are. And they are no pressure for your life. They're going the, no stress in pursuing happiness itself. So in the beginning of debate, we are going to talk about the working class itself. Working class in this era is full by the people in the millennials sections of the society, which they are working and they tend to brainwash. If you want to chase the happiness, if you want to be happy or succeed in your life, then you must have the high income itself. But with this kind of mindset, it's resulting that there is a two effect of this kind of mindset. First, there's a unhealthy and high fast competitive, and this competitive happen with the unfair reasons. And the second thing is there the unfair incomes with the three side effects. First, the with the unfair incomes only for several of people, they're going to give effect only to give the prosperous life to certain of people. And then second things, with this certain of wages, it's only benefiting the rich people, which going to give effect if you are the one who have power, or you are working in the private company and then you are going to affect the government, and then the one who are going to influence on how the government making decisions in policy is the one who are rich or having more capital. And the third things, this going to be affect the unhealthy social life, where people are going compare their life to the high social life status that they are actually cannot achieve that no matter what happen, no matter how hard they work, because of their disadvantaged background of life and also their lack of the skills. So we believe that this kind of effect to uh, are going to disadvantage the individuals in the working class anyway, and the working class have small chances to change the situations. Because of that, because of this dire situations, seems this kind of impossible to change the status quo, we believe that it's better for everyone with with
Point.
their skill or their uh, knowledge to have fair income, or I mean like have a similar income, which in accept in accept condition if they are the bosses or they are the leader, or if they are in a certain higher positions. And oh, is there anyone want to POI? Who?
CEO, please.
Okay, sure.
In the event that they cannot actually move and climb the social ladder, wouldn't it be actually better for them to have at the very least savings or at least high income for them to always sustain their life in comparison to your goal?
Okay, if you are going to talk about the high income, we should talk about in what in what capability you want you want to give or you want to contribute so you can get the higher incomes. As we already told you that at least there are two reasons or two things that you should have. First, you should have the proper background of your life, such as like your study and then your relationship and stuff. And the second thing, you should have advanced skills that at least can more than your colleges in the uh, in the world where high income inequality and average income, it seems it's almost impossible to achieve this kind of improvement, because you know that if the low small people have the possibility, means that this motion should not be talked at the very first time, right? That's why we believe that there is small chances in changing the situation itself. So after after this kind of setup, then we are going to open this debate. Thank you.
Before, so let's go to the next speaker, leader of opposition. Here.
I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. In government side of the house, basically they defend socialism, right? They defend manifestation of socialist communism, where everyone is poor and everything is equal. Look, communism and socialism will always fail, just like Union Soviet and all this kind of communist country that is doomed to fail because Karl Marx is not perfect. This ideology is too good to be true, and history has proven how communism has failed over time. Like that's why capitalism exists in the very first place. Like that's why in our side of the house we will defend capitalism. We say it's okay to have to work with a high income inequality and high average income as a working class compared to their side of the house. Like okay, one major rebuttal that going to that going to respond to the case. Okay, look, basically their work building is really unclear, right? The only explanation is okay in their side because everyone is poor and everyone is equally poor, then everyone is happy. Look, if that is the case, then you need to defend North Korea. They have low average income with low income inequality. Are they happy? Definitely happy, am I right? Okay, because low income inequality and
Sir,
low
on that
average
point,
income does not necessarily mean happiness, because that means everyone is poor except the government, and the government will be the one to redistribute it, right? This is the same things that happened in the
sir,
past era
your
of
iPhone
monarchy, no
closing.
thank you, where the noble and royal take all the money and then make 90% of their majority population equally poor because they are rakyat jelata and not noble. And doesn't that result in a low income and low inequality? Because most of people are poor except the nobles, where they say things like, oh, are you hungry, poor people? Just give them cake. This is what makes guillotine really popular in the past era, right? That's why.
Sir, on that point,
That's why we think the PM really need to clear what kind of work will result in the side of the house, what kind of low income inequality, what kind of thing that these working class people will pursue under their side of the house. I will take you at 5, yeah, okay. I'm going to talk about 2 things in my argument. Number 1, how people will still pursue materialistic value both in both sides of the house, and number 2, on how in our side the meaning of life will be better. Like okay, number 1, how people will still pursue materialistic value in both sides of the house. Both sides of the house need to agree that you, as human, you will never be always satisfied towards something, because you will always look up to your side, to yourself, right? Because even rich people look up, they want to become richer. Then obviously poor people will also do that, right? Because government side of the house doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is poor. Because this debate talk about average, right? It means that while the majority of people are poor, there will be still rich people, and these working class people will still look up to them, right? This not satisfaction, because as human you will always demand something that is not you have, right? Because the grass is always greener other side of the house, right? But then the step by step that they make in order for them to manifest this kind of thing is the important thing, right? It is something that will matter, right? Because okay, in government side of the house, because they are working class and they have low income inequality, and maybe it's possible to get out of poverty in their side of the house. However, in their side of the house, failure will be always, society will always blame yourself, blame the individual if you have failure base, because the chance of alleviating yourself from this poverty is really high, right? Compared to our side. Okay, we admit that in our side of the house, the chances to alleviate yourself from poorness is something that is really hard to do, right? Because capitalism and stuff, right? However, at the very least, in our side, we as working class have this vital power that we can abuse. What is that? It is the blame game. We can blame the system, we can blame all the rich people, we can blame Elon Musk, we can blame Amazon CEO, I forgot his name, and Jeff
Point
Bezos,
from closing.
and it actually work in Canada, New Zealand, America. There are politicians like AOC, Bernie, Warren that actually protect these working class people because they want their vote, and the policy itself is actually manifest.
Point from
because
closing.
because we have now health insurance, we have worker insurance, minimum wage, and all this kind of thing that always grow from years to years. Like we have better working class that roles now, right? That's why this kind of thing becomes important for you to sustain yourself, because in both sides of the house you are poor anyway, and that's why you need this way to sustain this kind of thing. Okay, sure, CG.
The fact that neither AOC or Bernie Sanders even became the Democrats' candidate for election shows that the system itself is not that easy to be toppled down by simply you being protesting or blaming
I
to the
understand.
rich people.
Okay, I understand your point. Look, AOC is already in the Senate House, and Bernie Sanders already hold a great power in the democracy. And okay, they have Joe Biden, but Bernie Sanders will become the part of their House Senate anyway. So which shows you that this kind of thing still becomes something that is something that they can pursue. And not only that, my point is that years by years, there will be always new people, new politicians who wants to gain working class vote, because their number is growing, and obviously they want new roles to better themselves, to better their working condition. And at least, even if they don't be able to get rich, they will still be able to have a comfortable life, right? This is the exclusive benefit that is coming from opening opposition. But number two, let's talk about how meaning of life, how it is going to be better, the pursuit of happiness. Look, in our side, we assume that capitalism is really everywhere. So that's why working class people in our side will demand our way towards something that is not materialistic, towards a life that is not materialistic. That is why it's your life is not going to be just like in government side, where because they have the chances, they will always pursue rich. They want to become rich. They want to become Jeff Bezos. But in our side of the house, they will demand happiness that does not exclusively comes from this money. They will search for love, search for all these kind of things that is not necessarily tied by materialistic value. All the point of happiness will be tied with this kind of value that wants to acquire happiness without materialism. That's why it is really important to vote for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition, for that amazing speech. Now, to continue the government case, I would like to call the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So, ladies and gentlemen, the opening opposition comes into this debate with telling us that in our side of the house, we're going to have this kind of, for example, communism and socialism economic to begin with, but they say that it, no matter what, it's going to be fail. But you know that opening opposition doesn't tell us any further explanation about it, right? And the second thing that is coming from the opening opposition is that they tell us that every side of the house agree that the end every purpose of people is to pursue materialistic to begin with, right? But you know that in our side of the house, we think that materialistic is not the only way. It's not the only source where you can get happiness. But we think that there are also other things. For example, you know that maybe they can pursue happiness in other things, such as being, by contemplating themselves and uh, self assessment. They could get this kind of happiness when they are being grateful and stuff like that, right? And in their side of the house, uh, in our side of the house, we think that people are going to see, the reality, and that some people are capable of seeing things that in the reality is just a mundane thing. That materialistic is just a mundane thing. And we think that some people also focuses on, some other things like metaphysical stuff and so on and so forth, right? So we think that what every bench need to understand is that there are also other things to pursue happiness to begin with, uh, and it's other than materialistic, right? So coming to my argument. So in opening government, we think that in a world where everyone has the same average of income, meaning that almost everyone that work as an employee or staff will likely to have the same amount of wage to begin with, right? And therefore when you have this same average of income, and there are also a low income inequality, uh, wait. Therefore, when you have this same average of income, and there are also a low inequality, meaning that everybody in the working class will be paid with average same income, right? We think that because of those same average of income, there will be more likely these people in the working class to also have the same outcome to begin with, right? They will be likely to have the same amount of outcome also, and they will basically buy this same stuff, like what kind of food they eat for the daily basis, and how many times a month they go shopping or buy new clothes, for example, right? uh Wait, I need to close my Discord. Mm. And therefore we think that in our world where the people are have where and therefore we think that in our world where the people are have the same outcome to begin with, there will be more likely for these people to have the same lifestyle, right? Because because they share the average same amount of income, while the income inequality is relatively low, meaning they are sharing the same wage to begin with, right? And therefore what they're going to spend it for will also be relatively the same, right? So these people will likely to have a same lifestyle to begin with, right? So what is the benefit in our world when you have this relatively same lifestyle, right? We think that the society where we live in is going to be more stable in terms of the social life that each individual in the working class have to begin with, right? The gap of social life of these working class people are going to be relatively low, so therefore you're going to have a more stable society where there is a really low rates of trouble or problem in the society because of the inexistence of the gap in the very first place, right? And that kind of thing is going to be happening in our side of the house where people are live in the harmony because the gap is relatively low. And we think that the society will be, will be more in order, right? So that we are also have those kind of the things as government insurance and stuff like that. So therefore, even if in our side we have an average low income, but we still can live in a welfare because we're going to have, like some sort of subsidy from the government and stuff like that, right? So we think that in our side of the house, even though the average of the income is low, but because of the subsidy coming from the government, we think that people in the working class will be okay with that, right? And also because of this, because of we have relatively low income inequality, meaning that this every people will be the same, right? So we think that the gap between every people will likely be the problem will likely be very little, right? So I think by all those reasons we propose the motion.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, for that good speech. I would like to call the Deputy Leader of Oppositions to close the opening debate here. Open the closed debate. I would like to call the government member here.
I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Before we moving on, let's just agree that we cannot make that opening government cannot go above closing government, because as opening opposition said, they only debate about the perception of life and etc. They really didn't debate about what's going to happen to these poor individuals in a practical sense. Ladies and gentlemen, what's going to economic condition and the world that they're going to portray under their side is very unclear, meaning they cannot go above closing government. But opening opposition also has some problems in the sense that their perception of life, such as how they want to, also have kids and want to fight for their children, for example, meaning that they also want to fight for a Marxist world, but under their side, they also want to diss Marxism, for example. They want to diss countries that do like communism, like their first, that like LO said, communism doesn't work, but they also want to fight for a more socialistic and Marxist society. Inconsistent, we do not think they can go above closing government. What is going to be in the closing government, ladies and gentlemen? As closing government, we're actually going to characterize to you what is going to be the needs of these working class people to begin with, because I do not think that either side in the opening debate actually characterize this to the fullest extent. Secondly, though, I'm also going to tell you why a world in which income inequality is there to such a high extent will necessarily hamper the ability of the working class to actually provide for their family, and also the exploitation exactly like opening opposition wants to achieve, but cannot because of the high income inequality, ladies and gentlemen. But before that, let's several clarification, right? Basically, what opening opposition try to do is to dumb down our benefit by saying that most likely our world is going to be fucked up like Venezuela, North Korea, etc. We do not think that this is going to be the case. Most likely those countries are living in a dictatorship, for instance, meaning that they do not necessarily have a governing body in which they can manage the economy directly. The problem is not really like the low income inequality per se, but just a mad dictator leading in the position of power that makes the country go downhill to begin with, right? So we do not think that's going to happen under our side. We still want to a stable government, for instance. We still want a sane person and a Senate, for example, they're still running smoothly, right? But secondly, let's also talk about their characterization about how there will be safety net under their side, and then we do not think how this is going to be the case, right? Knowing that countries like America, for example, that also has high income inequality and also high average income, do not necessarily have the safety net to begin with, knowing they cannot afford insurance, for example, knowing that public services are actually going to be paid for under their side, necessarily mean that the poor do not have access to, even though the country may be well developed, for instance, and so that is still something that did not get explained by opening opposition. By the way, the third thing, obviously, about how you want to have good perception of life, you want to fight for a kid, for example, if they want to have a more Marxist society, then exactly that is what we're providing here by providing more equality under our side. But also, fourthly, if you want to have the perception of non-materialistic gains, we also think that's going to be possible under our side, knowing that you can still have meaning under both sides of the house. So we do not think that the perception of life is such an important argument, by the way, in this debate, right? So moving on to our arguments, two arguments in this debate. Firstly, I'm going to characterize to you what is the need of the poor to begin, not the poor, the working class to begin with, right? Notice that most likely these individuals are from a low academic background, ladies and gentlemen, right? Most likely they came from villages, for example, they came from rural areas, for example, in Indonesia, they most likely came from eastern side of Indonesia, Maluku, Papua, for example, meaning that their life is necessarily not going to be have sunshine and rainbows to begin with. They do not have access, for example, to a manager's position, to be a banker, for example, because they necessarily cannot access those high amount of education because they're structurally disenfranchised in the system, right? Meaning, what do they need, ladies and gentlemen? What they need isn't really a place for them to actualize themselves in a sense that they want to climb up the social ladder, for instance, but we say what they need is the basic necessities, right? What they need is to just work in a factory, for instance. Living paycheck to paycheck in mediocrity is still somewhat of a good thing anyway, because they still want to provide for their family, for instance. They can still, for example, pay up their rent. They can still like pay their rights, for example, right? They can still or at the very least have a dream of wanting to achieve a humble home by actually saving, for example, this and that, right? Meaning that their work, that their benefit and their like perception of what is a good life is necessarily going to be different from those who are in the upper class, for example, meaning they are going to necessarily be content with the bare necessities anyway, because the only thing that they can achieve is that in the size. So both sides are going to have that, because notice under their side, even though they have higher average income, they will still be stuck in the low rung, the Rust Belt, for example, meaning they still cannot achieve that. I mean, what the poor want to achieve is basic necessities to begin with. Why the poor cannot achieve that under opposition side of the house, ladies and gentlemen? Because notice what's going to happen when you have high income inequality, right? Meaning that there will be the mega rich and also the mega poor. Why is this going to lead to exploitation, ladies and gentlemen? Because notice what's going to happen in that side, right? Notice that when the rich have that much capital to begin with, and the poor literally has no power to oppose it, ladies and gentlemen, and the rich have every avenue and also every opportunity to structurally disenfranchise the poor under exactly that side of the house. What we need is they have the power, for example, to buy out the government. They have the power to make sure that they can bypass, for example, the work regulations and the safety regulations that exist in the province, for example, right? Also, they can buy out if there is if they are actually going to be prosecuted by local law enforcement, for example, knowing that most likely they are going to just buy out the police, the chief of police, for example, and make them sure that we can pay our workers whatever the hell we want, right? Meaning that they're under their side, the poor will necessarily be less well off because of being structurally disenfranchised, meaning that the necessities that we say that are going to be needed under their side, the paycheck to paycheck daily basis can be achieved, right? Because either A, they get into workshop accident, for example, because they cannot have the necessary protection and tools so that they can work safely in the smelter, for example, or two, because their bosses are actually structurally getting all of the money and exploiting the poor, so that the money that is supposed to go to the poor goes to actually the rich, for example, and they do not pay them, meaning that they necessarily cannot pay their family anyway, right? What is going to happen under our side of the house, ladies and gentlemen? What we say the world is going to look like under our side is a world in which the poor is most likely going to stay the same, knowing that there is going to be like upah minimum provinsi, for example, right? But the difference is under our side, the ones who are in the upper middle class, for example, are going to have their wage, are going to have their income cut down, not so they're going to be quote unquote more equal to us, but maybe there will still be some gap, right? But the reason why this is important step into the right direction, right? Because we are actively lessening the power of the rich to exploit us, ladies and gentlemen. Notice of the argumentation I said before is inherently tied to your material power, to your wealth, because most likely the world revolves on money. The way that you can exploit and beat the system is through money, ladies and gentlemen. When you have less of that, you can necessarily not be able to exploit the workers so much, because you cannot have the money to exploit the government, for example. You do not have the money to actually lobby them to a certain extent in which they can to a certain extent in which they can just freely exploit them. I mean, they will be necessarily have to be more in line with the actual rules and regulation that is going to be protecting for the poor, for example. Meaning that the poor is going to be necessarily be more well off. They're going to be able to fulfill their daily needs and not going to be exploited, and they're still going to be treated as a human being under our side of the house, ladies and gentlemen. If you want all of that, and if you do not like exploitation of the poor, then vote for closing government. Thank you very much.
Thank you, member of government, for that speech. Now, to open the closing opposition case, I would like to call the member of opposition. Here.
The debate talks mostly about socialism versus capitalism, right? But I think that this debate does not require such analysis. Even if it does, I think that there should be an explanation why then that particular word that is portrayed by theme opening debate, ladies and gentlemen, and need to be able to be linked back to the interest, to the very interest of these individuals in the working class at the end of the day, right? So I think that closing opposition is going to deal with that to win this debate. But number two, I think that closing government also cannot take this debate simply because they only play in the worst case scenario, noting the fact that this high income inequality, for example, those people who are the elites, who sit on the top tier class of the societal structure, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be that detrimental and also that vile to those people who are in the poor communities, right? So what under closing opposition is trying to do? I think we are going to engage to a lot of spectrums. But before I'm going to enter to my point of substantive, several setup and also framing that is going to debunk all the entire argument
expectation coming from closing government. So what you need to understand, how does our world will look like under closing opposition? Look, the presence of high income individuals does not automatically result it into detrimental effect to the overall society. Under our side, we are going to tax those individuals, for example, who possess more material wealth. This is to say, the more you possess material wealth, the more you are going to be taxed, ladies and gentlemen, right? So this exact mechanism is the one who allow affirmative policy, for example, for the poor, because the money is used for the housings for marginalized communities, for example, right? To allow the poor communities to access the healthcare and also education under closing opposition side of the house, right? The idea of NGO to be operationalized because of the donation coming from these wealthy individuals, ladies and gentlemen, will be resulted into a positive impact and also change towards poor communities under our side of the house, ladies and gentlemen. Cross subsidy will exist under closing opposition. This is to say, income inequality does not always benefit the elites, because we think that more power comes with responsibility, and this is how this is how we envision our work in closing opposition. We are not going to left the poor with no alternatives. And the two things that I'm going to talk about in my speech. Number one, I'm going to talk about, number one, what does this working class individual need the most? How our work will cater that. Number two, I'm going to talk about and question, do the benefits that is promised by team opening government and also closing opposition with closing government is going to fly at the end of the day, right? So moving on to the first point of contribution. What does this working class individual need the most, and how our work will cater that, right? So the context that you need to understand is that I think what you need to understand is what is the working class working. This never been contextualized by three of the team into this debate, right? I think you educators need to know. So first, they are working at manual and industrial jobs. We are talking about maintenance engineering, auto mechanic, for example, or even machine operationalization. Notice, these type of jobs possess a higher risk to these individuals who are working in that field, ladies and gentlemen, right? They are exposed to a danger on a daily to daily basis, because basically, for example, they are technically dealing with a huge and gigantic machine, for example, that might put themselves at risk on a daily basis. In this situation, what is important for this type of individuals are protections, health insurance, security, and so on and so forth, ladies and gentlemen, right? So let's compare both sides of the house. Under government, those who own the company, for example, is not going to be able to provide these type of rights of the laborers under two reasons, right? Number one, because under their side, which they also concede, they might not have as much as capital. Notice that the income inequality is relatively low, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, those who sat in the top tier position individuals, for example, might not necessarily have a massive or extravagant capital to cover these manual workers' protection, ladies and gentlemen, such as health insurance and so on and so forth, right? So even if under their side of the house, in the best case scenario, they're going to get a job, but the idea of protections that making them feel secure in their own working places, for example, is not going to be fulfilled under government side of the house. But second, the reason why it is extremely likely is because when these top elites, for example, who might own the factory under their side of the house, always focus on the profit maximization, right? I think that those people who are rich, for example, who might probably own the factory, always focus on profit maximization. So let's compare. We understand both CEO or factory owner might maximize profit, but why it is better under closing opposition? Under their side of the house, yes, they are rich. The rich is not, yes, they are rich, but the rich is not going to be that rich. Thus, the presence of protection might be very minimum and might not be sufficient comparatively with the work that they are doing, right? At least under our side of the house, we understand that they might also maximize profit at the end of the day. But at least we are not stingy to provide the working class protection, because we understand when we give extravagant amount of protection to our laborers, for example, we are still able to possess this particular extremely wealthy profit maximization, for example, under our side of the house, right? So I think that the protection and also health insurance that we give to our laborers is going to be prioritized under our side of the house. I think that this is likely to be done by this particular factory owner. Why is that so? Because they also want to give an incentive and also reasons for these people to keep working for them, ladies and gentlemen, right? So the whip cannot come to the stage by saying, because they also provide, have to give and also acquire a lot of profit or a profit at the end of the day. They don't think that it is likely. No, we say that it is likely because this is the exact incentive, for example, for people to work with them, right? But second contribution, right? Do their benefit really fly, ladies and gentlemen? Look, the wrong conception under government, they assume low income inequality equals with everyone getting a job. We say that it's not true. Just because a country have low income inequality does not mean everyone has a job, ladies and gentlemen. Under our side of the house, even when not everyone has a job, for example, at the very least, these extremely wealthy individuals, for example, is able to create a cross subsidy, for example, and also a protection net for our poor, simply because we tax them more, right? I think that this is how we empower the poor individual under our side of the house to be able to survive on a daily basis. And I think that this is important. It is not going to happen under their side of the house because they also notice that everyone will focus on their own survivability simply because they might necessarily have the exact same amount of income and so on and so forth, right? This is the reason why under closing opposition, we are very proud to oppose.
Thank you, member of oppositions. Now to close the closing government case, I would like to call the whip of government. You hear?
I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. In a world where very rich people see very poor people every day in the streets, you cannot deny the fact that social tension will definitely happen. Why is this social tension very bad? Because of the idea of oppression from the rich people towards poor people is very significant. That is to say, poor people do not even have access for their food, do not even have access for their rent, simply because rich people who fights for profit, who only is profit oriented, stops fighting for them and stop wanting to pay them with an equal wage simply because they think, oh, I want profit. We don't want this kind of world. We want a world where people can live with a sustainable living, where people have low income, but it's more than enough for them to satisfy their need of food, to satisfy their needs of rent, and etc. We are so very proud to propose. I'm going to address 3 direct comparisons. Firstly to OG, secondly to O, and lastly to closing opposition. Firstly, though, let's just kick OG out of the debate because basically they're talking about, oh, people have no chance to advance their skills, talking about unfair competitions, but they never really explain why then this is prominent in their side. 3 points of weighing that makes us rank above OG. Firstly, on the idea of people background. Well, if we're being generous, this is the only major point coming from OG, right? But the thing is, this claim standing alone will not do them any good. Comparatively, we did explain why this claim can happen in our side. Because we already told you that the oppression of rich people towards poor people is very principally unjustified, based on the idea that people come from different backgrounds, based on the idea that people, that birth lottery exists, that not all people have access to property and not all people have access to higher education and privilege. This is why this claim only happens in closing government. 2, on the idea of competition. Why did we explain the idea of competition better? Because notice that the competition in OG is merely an assertion, right? But we did explain here. We explained to you how competition is better in our side in a way that people will still need to satisfy their need. People will still need to satisfy their need of basic necessity like food and rent, and therefore competition will happen. But lastly, in the term of responsiveness, if you pay closer attention, they never really did respond to any of OOKs, right? Well, we did. I'm going to explain this later. But 2 exclusive contributions, right? Firstly, we told you what from closing government. Firstly, we told you how the idea of exploitation is very abhorrent, and we told you how this happens because of the tension between social classes that promote the idea of hating one another. Clash of ideas will form itself to be a very dangerous conflict, right? We win from OG by a mile based on this extension alone, because this harm outweighs the entire premise of OG's simplistic portrayal of why proposition's role is much better than opposition's. Secondly, and more importantly, we didn't explain the most plausible portrayal of the world that is to happen in upside, which is the idea of fluctuation. This is where Fred's extension makes sense, because we answered the POI that CO gave to OG that they failed to explain. We told you that a country or a world with higher average income doesn't guarantee that you have a higher income in our side, right? But more importantly, even if you do have higher income, fluctuation happens. That is to say, the fluctuation of the pricing of rice, of, simply mineral water for simply rent is going to be very fluctuative. That even if you have high money, you won't be able to have a sustainable living because the prices are always changing and the prices are fulfilling the demand of the rich and capitalist people. We do not want to stand for this world. That's why OG is out. Secondly, on OO, I have like 3 points of weighing here. Number one, on talking about idea of communism. Number two, about pursuit of happiness. And lastly, safety net. Firstly, idea of communism. I don't think LO can step in here and suddenly say that the entire premise of communism falls. An ideology can exist if they are to some extent, fulfilling towards people and fulfilling people's political leniency. But let's say that we take our very worst case scenario, that we defend North Korea, just like the burden that OO throw at us. This is still much better in our side. Because notice that we don't need to defend economic development. The most important actor that we need to advocate here in individual basis life, especially working individuals. You have to struggle from paycheck to paycheck. In this scenario, we say it's much better in North Korea when you're collectively poor, compared to high pressure and oppression towards poor people in super capitalist countries like America, where they have to work crazy hours to even have a chance to provide food in their table. At least in our side of the house, you have the same reaction from government and private sectors, comparatively in their side where they don't, and where poor people are constantly oppressed by rich people. This is where Fred's extension about fluctuation step in. Because notice that the pricings will be determined on absolutely arbitrary standards in society with enormous difference in income. That is to say, if you even have higher income in their side, the income is not sustainable because the fluctuation of prices is very tough to be dealt with. When DLO comes and say protests will happen wanting economic development, I think this is definitely not urgent at all, right? Because the actor that we're defending here are working class people who have to struggle paycheck to paycheck. They could give less shit about how they have the country have economic development. Secondly, on the idea of pursuit of happiness. The idea of happiness by opening opposition, which is, by the way, just a straw man, is based on very unrealistic pursuit of materialism. As we explained before, it's not even plausible in the first place. But the happiness that you get in our side is tangible and easy to prove. Their side fails to realize that the main interest of working class people are not to buy a freaking yacht, is to make sure that they can pay their rent and buy rice for their family. That's why they don't find their happiness in simply pursuing for materialistic values. They find happiness in pursuing simple values that can provide them living and that can sustain their living for their family. But there has been a dangerous and contradicting claim from both speakers. LO says that people will still resort to materialism. The LO says that people will be nihilistic. This alone causes their career to crumble. But more dangerously, we say the idea of nihilism will not even happen in our side because of the concept that all people feel the same as you do. To the contrary, in which economic gap are huge to say the least inside opposition. This is why people opt into riot. People opt into labor protest day in May 1st. People opt into violence and underground activity like robbing and stealing as a form of protest to the huge economic gap. In our side, none of this will even happen because all of them live in a similar environment based on economic level. Lastly, on the idea of safety net. On the idea of safety net, I think this claim cannot stand. As long as OO didn't explain why the income they get in their side will be sustainable. The logic stays the same. You getting higher payment doesn't mean that you get you get better or even the same service you need because of fluctuation. If DLO wants to bring externalities like COVID and national disaster, well, this point backfires because in their side, the only people who can sustain themselves are people who are rich, people who have enough money to buy vaccines and underground shelters. Well, if they want to justify this in principle, they cannot because the idea of riches are very contingent on arbitrary factors. For example, as birth lottery or border lottery, in principle, their cases have completely fallen. Their best claim, oh, you can protest the government. But my POI was answered very weakly by simply saying that, oh, Bernie and AOC are still sitting in the Senate. Well, guess what? That's not good enough. This is where first extension also makes the entrance because the majority of government are filled with capitalist people. When the Republic conservatives still dominate the House, the capital owners will have an easy way of lobbying them, right? In the sense that they can pay the government for making a property that benefits them. And in other way, always out. But CO lastly. They mainly talk about the behavior of rich people, how they will not be oppressive. I'm going to deconstruct this framing completely because the idea of rich people being able to operate, they pull in a whole lot of working class people to work in their industry and company. The claim of people working, being very vulnerable to heavy machinery will be perpetuated in our side. In our side, heavy machinery will not even be, it's 7 minutes, will not even be that expensive, right? Because of the idea of fluctuation and etc. But the idea of subsidy that they give will not even be feasible. Firstly, you will need a lot of prominent leftists voicing for this. Secondly, we say it's not significant at all because subsidies will only help people, on fulfilling their basic needs in a very capitalist world. And it's not important because they fail to explain why then capitalist values will not happen in their side of the house when people are given food and housing. It will be still not be enough because people will still pursue for higher and higher needs based on people, based on the exposure of capitalist values. Dying is bad. I think we should agree on that. And while the best solution from OG is people dying on a shame, from OO people dying with dignity, and from CO people being protected in work without even assuring money to buy protection and food from evil regime from capitalist companies, we say people can live, people can sustain themselves, can pay for rent, and food is more than enough. For sustainability and for life, we are very proud to propose.
Thank you, Web of Governments. Now to close the overall debate, I would like to call the opposition with here.
I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel noticed that the closing government has yet to even address a single point that was coming from Karendi, right? Karendi mentioned a lot about how a mechanism should work in the opposition side, in which something that is missing from the entire opposition bench, except when CO came in. I think that this mechanism has yet to be rebutted as to why it is not likely. Therefore, I think that it is style, and therefore it still possesses like big contributions on CO cases, right? But before I'm going to whip CO first as to why we should win this debate. First, I think that we are the only team in the sides of oppositions that mechanize our benefits. Opening opposition says that there will exist government subsidy that will empower the country and public services. This will result in a good healthcare. This will result in a good etc., etc., etc. You can name any form of benefits, right? Sure, their benefits might exist, but the problem is that opening opposition never explained to you how does the government possess or even get this kind of possess the capital to provide enough of subsidy at the end of the day, right? I think that CO provides a mechanism that was a prerequisite for OO benefit to fly. In the CO world, they will possess this. There will be people that are going to be filthy rich that can actually do business, that can actually bring income towards our economy at the end of the day, in which you can actually tax them and let these tax things to also pay for all of our public services, right? But in the sides of government, most likely this will not happen, because most likely what the government are going to do is that they're going to limit the amount of business that are access, because this is the reasons as to why high income access, right? High income disparity access, because there's access of business that actually topple and grab those kind of people to higher amount of degree. This is why Jeff Bezos, for example, become the richest people in the world, exactly because they can do business. But in their sort of house, most likely that this kind of business will not happen. Government need to also maintain their own safety net. They need to, I don't care. I don't think that is relevant anyway, right? But second, opening opposition safety net arguments are arguments that possess benefit. Sure, but these arguments are not exclusive. This means that the entire benefits that OO told you, that the benefits of healthcare are most likely are going to be accessed by everyone in the community, right? This is not an interest that is specifically designed only towards this working class community. This is where currently extensions matter, where you are going to provide a better protections in the work system of this working class society, that they will have a better protection. I think that this is far more exclusive than OO explained to you. Lastly, I think that closing government also dismissed most of current analysis, right? That is why the low average income is bad, for example. I think that this is now at the end of the day. But sure, let's map several things. First, we agree with closing government that the meaning of life is not important within this debate. Why? Because I don't think that we can generalize that non-materialistic way of life is actually a good way for everyone to live. People still have values towards materialistic way of life. I decide, for example, to become a filthy rich and work in the top tier law firm, ladies and gentlemen, even without any time to spend on my friends or hobby or love. I don't think that you can simply generalize this kind of meaning. I don't think that is relevant. But second, closing government argues that this world and this in their world and in our world, working class will literally possess no capital, right? They say that in their own arguments. They will not possess capital at all to fight against the rich. I think that this is wrong contextualizations. Note panel, these working class are not Gojek because they still entitled, not like Gojek, which Gojek do not possess or entitled to any minimum wages, right? That their workers' protections are not guaranteed by the government. These working class are most likely are going to be protected, and most likely the amount of wages, the minimum amount of wages that they are going to possess are fortunately the exact average income in those kind of country. This means that in our side of the house, most likely these working class people are going to possess high average income at the end of the day, right? This also directly nullify the entirety of the closing government cases in which they state that people cannot even buy necessities. Because in our world, these working class people possess actual capability exactly because the minimum wage is that high at the end of the day, right? But now, I think that there's only one big clash in this debate. What's that? First, whether or not high income inequality will actually high income inequality and those rich will actually exploit you or not, right? OG told us, and closing government also told us, that rich people will only exploit the poor, right? I think that the world that was envisioned by them was simply simplistic. The world is not as cruel as what OG depicts to you. I think that the rich requires the support of the people, and we think that there will be created a better counterbalance in our side of the house. Why? Look, if this company do appear as evil as being on earth, as an evil being on earth, in our world, people will revolt and cancel them, right? Sure, Hans might brought this, but I'm going to provide a better direction towards this kind of arguments. Michelle Obama, for example, established a fashion company, but just a single scandal that threatened public interest occurred from her company policy, the company was canceled. I think that this is an exclusive benefit that can only come from the world of opening of the closing opposition. Why? Because only by having a high average amount of income, this is the moment that you possess the capital to spend on other tertiary needs. That this means that you do not need to actually worry about your basic necessity. This means that you can spend on education. This means that you can spend on internet, etc., etc., etc. This makes the people more aware of their own rights, and they will be able to organize social movement to cancel exploitation company will be easier for them in the sides in oppositions, right? But in the comparison in their sort of how, less capital will be spent on education and internet exactly because they need to cater to their own protections and their own basic necessity. But most importantly, and the most dangerous thing, is that the people are going to be very dependent on the state aid. I think that this is bad because this means that you're not going to revolt at all because you're going to depend your lifeline towards the state. This is simply bad. But even if, for example, the rich are going to influence on politics, why this will be still better in the world of opposition. If the measures for rich to gain influence on politics is due to their fiscal contribution, I think that the people in our world possess the capital to actually serve as a counterbalance because they can communally fight against such lobbying. This is what happened in USA, ladies and gentlemen. Most of the Republicans were funded by large company, Google, anything that you mentioned. How does the Democrats win? How does the Democrats actually gain that kind of money? Doesn't that make you wonder? I think that these Democrats gain their money despite most of their policy that are starving the interests of the company. Because the people donate to the Democrats. In Google, for example, 80% of their employees donate a portion of their wages to the interest of the Democrats. You can always counter the bad politician interest by allowing these people to have an income that can able to make them able to spend on tertiary needs such as the politics as well, right? In the sides of the government, oppressive system will still exist, but the difference is you do not have the capacity to fight it exactly because now you're going to depend on it. But in our side of the house, you have the capital to actually counterbalance it. You can have the capital to support those politicians that are going to establish your own interest. Very proud to close the debate.
Okay, so thank you guys for the debate. I think it was a really good debate. So I'm going to jump quickly into my decisions and also the reasoning behind my decisions. So I think that me and Ramzi think that ultimately this is a closing debate. With the ranking as follows. Opening governments got fourth, and opening oppositions got third. Closing oppositions got seconds, and between closing government, closing oppositions, me and Ramzi, I think it was really close margin, but ultimately I gave the winning first to closing government. So why we think that this is a closing debate? Because I think that closing debate was the only bench that was able to characterize and was able to touch the spirit of the motions, which is what is actually the interest of the working class in and of itself. Because I think that this particular characterization was quite blurry in opening government and opening oppositions. For example, if opening governments want to say that, actually we want to like have no stress in pursuing happiness, and we want to close the social gap that happens in opposition world, I think there is no grounding down of analysis of why this is actually an inherent interest of the individual in the working class. This is also happens in opening oppositions. When you say that, we want to actually, we want to actually have creating a nation development, for example, or like we want to create a much more Marxism world and have a fighting for a meaningful life. I think there is also a grounding down on why this is actually the inherent interest of the individual working class. But more on that, I think that we considered closing government and closing opposition, so it's working on the same basis as opening bands. I think that the mechanizations on each particular argument was much more better in closing bands. For example, if opening governments want to say that there is a discriminations between the rich and the poor, I think that the picturizations of what actually happens and why this particular exploitations or like discrimination, like what happening in opening governments, what opening governments told you, was much more clear in closing governments, because closing governments was able to prove on why exactly exploitation happens. Because, for example, like there is a because they have capital to like buying out government or like escaping from the law enforcement, and therefore they have so much opportunity to actually exploit the poor. I think that the characterization was more clear in closing governments. Also coming from the closing oppositions, I think that even if that opening oppositions was actually bring the same argument about like the safety net on like on the externalities, for example, that exists, and like well-being of an individual, because if they actually kejeduk lantai, they will go the hospital quality will going to be low. I think that there is no grounding down on why this is exclusively uh, you know uh, in within the individual in working class case. I think closing opposition was able to prove that, because they are actually like they can characterize what actually is individual working class, because they are working at a manual industrial job, and therefore they have a high risk in their job, and therefore they need protections, and this safety net is important for this individual. So I guess closing opposition was able to prove more clear analysis on this importance rather than opening oppositions. So that's why I think closing bands inherently are able to prove why closing bands is more than opening debate. But why opening governments is less than opening oppositions is because I think opening governments was brought like the main idea of opening governments was about on how there is a discriminations and we want to decrease social gap, right? So let's talk about like the second one. Why this actually this is decreasing social gap. I think that number one, that why I think that I cannot buy this argument for coming from opening governments, because I think there's no analysis on why this is an exclusive harm. When actually when high income inequality exists, therefore like there is like a gap between the lifestyle and whatnot. But more on that, I think that opening oppositions was more able to prove on why this is actually not exclusive harm, because they said that this is the discrimination will still exist in the of the house, but not on the economical basis, but more on the racial basis. So therefore, questions why that particular harm was much more larger in terms of like harm in like economical basis rather than the racial basis, like what opening oppositions told to you. But I think I think in the way that opening governments was able to say was that this individual working class, they want to actually climb the social ladder, and we want to like have no stress in doing that. But I think that opening oppositions was able to question what if this individual was failed to actually pursuing this kind of social ladder. I think the opening opposition was able to provide that, hey, at least in outside the house, when you have a high income, you're going to have a safety net. When you actually does not able to climb the social ladder. But more on that, I think that I think that the individual, when they actually fail, they're going to blame themselves. But in their house, they're going to like blame the system instead, and they will not going to blame. They will not going to blame themselves. I think this able to like minimize the harm coming from opening government. But why closing governments was able to trim down to closing opposition? I think closing oppositions main idea was about on how like we want to have an labor protections, because this working class have a dangerous job, for example, because they're working in manual and industrial work. And therefore, I think labor protections will going to happen the moment when actually these rich people will going to feel enough of their profit maximizations, and they will able to prioritize this kind of labor protections. But more on that, for example, if these people are jobless, these capitalists will are more than willing to actually cross subsidize, because they feel that their profit are actually enough itself, right? But I think that why I cannot buy this particular argument, because I think that this particular analysis cannot stand if the nuance coming from closing governments about on how rich are always oppressing the poor are still stand in the end of the day. Because if the idea that coming from closing governments about the exploitation coming from the rich to the poor still stand, I think that the idea that coming from closing oppositions that how rich was more than willing to help the poor becomes questionable in a way, because there's no analysis on why like rich people have the incentive to actually help the poor in the end of the day. Although that I think the engagement coming from closing oppositions are potential, especially in web, for example, on how like we want to on how when actually these poor people have the possession of more wealth, and therefore they're going to can access internet and have the knowledge of rights, and therefore able to protest these people, or for example, if they have money, they can channel to another politicians rather than the politicians that are bought out by these three people, like what closing governments able to characterize. I think that ultimately, me and Ramzi think that this is new, because although this is not because although that this analysis was not entirely new per se, this is an extension of an assertion coming from Randy, coming from about on how like when you have a position of wealth, you're going to the more you can gain leverage. I feel like the nuance of this sentence of this analysis was really ambiguous, and the materialization only coming from the web in of itself. So therefore, I cannot expect like the web to actually like engage to like the engage to the materialization coming from closing oppositions analysis on this, on how like they on how wealth equal leverage, because like the picturization of what do you mean by wealth equal leverage was only happened in the web in and of itself. So therefore, although the analysis was really good and really potential, I think ultimately that this analysis was new, and therefore I think that I cannot count that, and therefore I think that the point coming from closing governments about on how like rich able to like exploit the poor are still stand in the end of the day. So I think so that's my whole jurisdictions. If you